Welcome to another episode of the Film Florida podcast. My name is John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. We have another great guest for you today. Before I introduce you to that guest, I wanted to thank you for downloading this episode of the podcast. Please make sure you subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. The better our analytics are, the more likely others will find us. Also, don't forget that we have a Film Florida merchandise page. Visit teespring.com/stores/Film Florida to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, and coffee mugs. Ben Rock is a Florida-born producer, director, editor, and more. Ben was born in Miami, then moved to Central Florida where he attended Winter Park High School and then UCF. In 1997, Ben was one of the 5-person production team that made the Blair Witch Project. In 2004, Ben and his producing partner formed Visible Man Productions to focus on projects that walk the line between content and advertising. In 2009, he directed the critically acclaimed sci-fi horror film Alien Raiders. In 2016, Future Boyfriend, a sci-fi romantic comedy Ben directed and edited, was an official selection of the Tribeca Film Festival. Today, he continues his film and theater passion, directing plays as well as serving for 2 seasons as co-artistic director for the Sacred Fools Theater Company in Hollywood, California. He's currently working on a horror comedy web series called 20 Seconds to Live. Here's our interview with Ben Rock. Thanks for joining us today, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So you were born in Miami and then moved to Central Florida, right?
Correct. Although my parents moved there when I was 6 weeks old, so I don't really have any memory at all of Miami from that time.
Okay. Well, talk about growing up in Florida and eventually going to UCF.
Absolutely. Well, and I should also say that the reason that my parents moved from Miami to Orlando was that my father, who is still in Orlando, was Bozo the Clown on Miami television, and basically his show had been let go by Miami and picked up in Orlando. And so I kind of grew up in Orlando because of television in a weird way.
Nice.
So I grew up in Orlando. I was always fascinated with movies, horror movies a lot when I was a kid and now. And because movies were not really there wasn't, Universal Studios didn't open until I was almost out of high school. The only way to involve oneself in the entertainment world, or the clearest, most accessible way, was through theater. And I started doing a lot of work in theater starting basically in middle school. I went to Maitland Junior High. It was a junior high then. I know it's a middle school now. And I did a bunch of plays there, and I did I took classes at what is now, I think, the Shakespeare Theater in Orlando, that at the time was the Civic Theater of Central Florida. Took like acting classes. I mean, I didn't honestly know what direction I wanted to go in, but acting seemed like it was the thing that was most in front of everyone's face. So that seemed like the obvious path for me until I realized I honestly didn't like acting. And I went to Winter Park High School, and I was very involved in the drama department and thespian troupe there. And our teacher at the time was a guy named Kit Haskett. And I don't know what kind of existential crisis he was going through in his life when I was in high school, but we didn't do a lot of the plays that you would automatically associate with high school theater. We did really challenging stuff. And honestly, the whole time I was there, I don't think we did a single musical. Because if it was all a bunch of musical song and dance stuff, I probably would have drifted off and gone in a different direction and found a different hobby, and maybe you and I would be talking right now. But my sophomore year, he did JB, which is Archibald MacLeish's retelling of the Book of Job in verse, set in a post-apocalyptic America. Just heady, crazy stuff. And so I got to work on some plays that had like real meat in them, and I didn't get any lead roles in them, but I started falling in love with the behind-the-scenes stuff. I did get cast in, I think, 1 or 2 of the plays while I was in high school, and also I met a guy who maybe you know, maybe you don't, named Billy Gardell.
Sure.
So Billy was 2 years ahead of me, and he was doing a kind of Saturday Night Live send-up called Winter Park Live, and I pitched him a bunch of ideas, and he brought me on as a writer. And I, got to work and perform with him. He did one of his earliest stand-up sets at that show, and it was like I got to see firsthand how the performing arts can like really affect and galvanize, a small group, a school. And I was always kind of headed towards film, but, I also still to this day do a lot of theater work. So, yeah.
And then you went to UCF and majored in film. So obviously, as you said, you're interested in the industry and then realized that you didn't want to be an actor. Was it before or during your time at UCF that you realized that behind the scenes was really where you were made to be?
Way, way, way before. It was when I was in high school. And honestly, I directed the first project I ever got to direct, which was a one-act play called Aren't You Supposed to Be Dead by a friend of mine who is still in Orlando named Jay Bogdanovich. It's the first thing I'd ever directed in my life. And we did like a one-act play festival and students could direct. And that was sort of where I started seeing like, oh, yeah, this is something that appeals to me more, and it's a lot of skills all at once that I didn't really have at the time, and I knew I was going to have to learn and work really hard to get there. It was exciting for me to kind of see that. So like before I even got out of high school, I was on a track where I wanted to direct, and I was starting to idolize a lot of them are horror filmmakers like Sam Raimi, but I fixed on Sam Raimi a lot, not just because I loved the Evil Dead movies that he made, that was a big part of it, but because he made the first Evil Dead movie when he was 19 years old. And I kind of had it in my head that I had to make my first film, obviously not a feature, but I had to make my first film when I was 19. So I wasn't even in film school yet. And I shot a video with an actor who I knew from Orlando theater named John Maynard, who I've worked with out here since in LA, again, when I was 19. But by that point, I'd kind of fallen in love with the idea of being a director and was kind of on the road to like learning all the skills, which, any director will probably tell you is a lifelong pursuit and you're never there. You're always trying to learn more stuff. And also, before I even went to the UCF film program, Valencia Community College, now Valencia College, had started their film program, which was an AS degree. So I went to Valencia, got my associate arts degree so I could transfer to a four-year college. And then I actually applied to it and was surprised that I got into their film program because I really didn't have the same credentials as a lot of other people who were in it. But that was all technical, all behind the scenes, and still is. And that program, I don't know how aware you are of it, but it's pretty amazing now. I was in Florida in April and I got a tour of that and UCF, and, they have both come a long way from their humble beginnings.
Yes, they certainly have. And if I read correctly, while you were in college, you were working as a special effects makeup artist and in the art department on independent films and commercial productions all over the Southeast, Miami, Orlando, Atlanta, New Orleans, Alabama, as well as doing local theater projects. How did you get those opportunities while you were still in college?
Well, so some of the art department stuff, and I didn't do very much art department. Some people are like, because I was the production designer on the Blair Witch Project, people ask me, every now and then someone will see if I want to production design their project. And I'm like, I've production designed exactly one thing in my life. And I was, in the art department on a bunch of commercials and movie of the week kind of thing. And it was, a PA kind of position. So it was very entry level. The art department stuff I did, and it was usually just, lugging set pieces around and building scaffolds. And I remember one on an Alpha insurance commercial, me and one other guy having to empty one hayloft, move all the hay to another hayloft, fill it up, and then take it all back the same day. Like that was just a crazy day, good workout. The makeup thing started, honestly, when I was probably about 12 years old. My dad's friend, Bob Goldberg, had given me Dick Smith's Do-It-Yourself Monster Makeup Handbook. And Dick Smith was like the guy who designed the makeup for The Exorcist and Taxi Driver and, Ghost Story, like all of these amazing movies Dick Smith had been the makeup designer for. I mean, I think The Exorcist is probably what he's most famous for, but he was amazing. And when I was in middle school, started kind of playing around with those techniques, and then moved to like slightly more professional stuff when I was literally in high school. And when I was in high school, they were doing a production of Frankenstein at the Civic Theater of Central Florida. And I was 17 years old, and I had made a Frankenstein prosthetic. And one day I walked in, I don't even know how I knew to go there, and I found the makeup room, and I found a woman named Amanda Llewellyn who was doing the makeup for that during rehearsals. And I told her who I was, and Amanda was, probably in her late 20s, early 30s at the time, and I was 17, and I was just all excited about doing this. And she kind of stepped in and mentored me for years. And so I was still in college when they did a production of Into the Woods, and they needed a witch and a wolf makeup. And at that point, I'd moved into making foam latex prosthetics, and they did a production of Cyrano, and I was, I got to do the nose, and I worked on a bunch of local theater projects in that way. But I got to know Amanda, and Amanda was working for a director named David Pryor, who was based out of Mobile, Alabama. And when I was in my third year of college, over the summer, they were making a movie in Mobile that was ultimately released as Raw Justice, with Robert Hayes, David Keith, and Pamela Anderson in the leads. And she trained me to be her assistant. And I went up to Alabama, and I, kind of like she would do all the leading ladies and all the really, really expensive talent, and then, would let me do kind of the secondary characters or the character actors or people who didn't need as much makeup. But basically, she just needed someone she could rely on. And she'd known me at that point for 6 years since I was a teenager. And I'm still in touch with her. She's in Atlanta now. But she trained me to be her assistant. So she brought me on to a couple of films in Mobile, and then I worked on some stuff in Miami that I kind of got on my own. Actually, one of those just through a producer who I think is still in Florida, named Joe Tankersley.
Yeah.
The most exciting one was I got to go to Thailand and for her to assist her again. And I worked on a movie called Bloodsport too. But I worked as an assistant for a few makeup artists. I got to key a few features. And it was during that period of time that I honestly realized that I didn't really want to be doing makeup, that I'd sort of been I actually remember I was working on this really excellent film called Rainy that was shot in Atlanta, and I'm in the makeup trailer, and I was the assistant makeup artist. There was a key makeup artist. There were on that one, they even had hair and assistant hair. So we had a big crew in there for that movie. And I was reading American Cinematographer. One of the hairstylist was like, "Why are you reading that?" And I was like, "Don't you care about like how what we do affects what they do?" And she's like, "Nope." And I was like, "I'm in the wrong department." But I mean, it's helped me a lot over the years. And, on some of my lower budget, goofier stuff, I'll break out the makeup and do, like I did, Bob DeRosa and I do a web series called 20 Seconds to Live. And a couple of times, usually if it's really serious, we get a real makeup artist. But the first couple episodes, we had to do a very grotesque severed face effect on Jay Bogdanovich, the guy who wrote the first play I ever directed. I kind of dusted off my makeup skills and cast his face and kind of did part of the making of the prosthetic, although it was very much a group effort. I did the getting of the face in the first place.
So you mentioned Bob, and actually we just spoke with him, and then speaking of the Blair Witch, you mentioned it earlier. We're going to be talking to Dan Myrick in a couple of weeks coming up. So we have this thread coming through. And so talking about the Blair Witch Project, you graduated from UCF in 1997, and then shortly thereafter, you got involved with a couple others. Looking back on that experience, what were some of those early conversations like that kind of made you decide to want to do that film? I mean, obviously you have a thing with horror flicks, but what specifically about the Blair Witch Project did you say, you know what, we should do this?
Slight correction. I graduated at the end of 95, like December of 95. So practically 96. So we started talking about the Blair Witch Project in 1996, or I should say I was read into the project in 1996. Ed, Dan, and Greg, Eduardo Sanchez, Daniel Myrick, and Greg Hale had already been talking about it for some time at that point. And it was around the time that I realized I didn't want to be a makeup artist anymore. And that was, when you're 24, 25 years old and you've been doing something since you're 12, it's kind of hard to be like, well, that's the end of that hobby. I'm done, moving on. And I wanted to focus on directing, but I kind of just wanted to, I don't know, this will happen to you in the entertainment industry, is like you need something that kind of re-engages you with why you do this in the first place, because you spend a lot of time chasing after projects you don't actually, like you care about them because they're jobs, but you don't feel them to the core of your being. And I lived about a block away from Greg Hale, and Greg had moved out to LA for like 9 months and had worked on the first season of Mad TV, and then had moved back to Orlando to pursue making the Blair Witch Project with Ed and Dan. I didn't know this yet. I was over at his house, and he kind of told me the basic premise, and it's the same premise everyone's heard about, the students went disappearing and a film turned up. And as a fan of not just horror, but also kind of like weird folklore and stuff like that, Greg really appealed to my love of like old folklore stories, and told me the Blair Witch legend as if it were a real thing. And I bought it, and it was still kind of very skeletal at that point. And then when he told me that it was a movie and how they were going to make it, I thought it was a really exciting idea, because it was not the way that I'd been making movies. It's not the way anyone had been making movies. It was such a different, out of the box way of doing it, and kind of an experiment. Like, there's 1,000 reasons why it could have failed or shouldn't have worked. And that, I found that exciting. And at the time, my overhead was pretty low. I had a clunky ass car. I believe I was waiting tables at the Briar Patch on Park Avenue in Winter Park and substitute teaching. And I was just kind of looking for something that really sparked me, and everything about the concept, the folklore of it, the production methodology, working with my friends, everything about it really sounded exciting, in the way that making a movie sounds exciting to you before you've done it, before you know how it's done, and then you learn how to do it. And then once you learn how to do anything, it becomes kind of a job. It was fun to be like, no, let's throw out the rules and do it this other completely different new way. And that was invigorating. And so I sort of begged Greg to let me work on it. I was really excited to work on it. And that was when they made me the production designer. But, it's like everyone's position on that was very unconventional, which is why I say I really have never been a production designer. But like everybody on that was kind of like, it was an all hands on deck filmmaking thing. And yes, like my main job was doing whatever art department stuff had to be done. But on days that there wasn't stuff to be done, I had to do other stuff, or, going out in the woods in the middle of the night and shaking a tent and scaring 3 people in a tent. Like that, I was one of the people who was doing that. And to me, that was, just a really exciting opportunity.
Well, and it's one thing to have passion for a project. It's another to have passion and that project turn out the way the Blair Witch Project did. So while you were making the film, did it feel any different than any of your other projects? Did you have any inclination of what was about to happen?
In terms of feeling different, it felt completely different, because we didn't make that movie like you make a real, I don't want to say a real movie, which I just kind of did, but we didn't make that movie we didn't make that movie with any of the conventional methods that you would use to make a movie. So there wasn't like a schedule and a call time and a call sheet and show up here and, this setup, then that setup. What it was it was a LARP, a live action role playing, where the actors were in a scenario that we had sort of built around them. And they were making a documentary about it in real time. So they're improvising all their dialogue, they're improvising everything, and we're sort of creating obstacles, almost like a reality TV show would do a little bit, but there was no reality TV at the time. And right. So, they were really camping out in the woods, and they were, really in that tent all night, every night. They left the woods once in the week because they got rained out. But other than that, they were there the whole time. And then, Greg, who had been, he was a graduate of Army Survival School, had kind of used techniques that they had used in Army Survival School to kind of gently wear them down a little bit. It's pretty simple. Wake them up in the middle of the night, which we did. Give them a little bit less food. They had enough food, but give them a little bit less food every day and make them walk around all day, make them exercise. And then they're actors, so they know that their job is to be scared. They know this is a horror movie, but they truly didn't know what they were going to wander into next. They just had coordinates on a GPS that they were heading towards, and they didn't know when they went to sleep what we were going to do to them. Mm-hmm. And so, it was completely different than working on any movie. Did it have an aura of this is going to be a giant hit? If any of us had the first inkling that it was going to be a hit, we would have second guessed every decision. And in my opinion, we would have screwed it all up. So, we couldn't focus on that. And moreover, at that point in my very, very early career, I'd probably worked on a dozen movies, maybe more, TV shows and blah, 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 commercials and stuff. And some that I directed, and a lot that I'd, either been a makeup artist or an assistant makeup artist on, or, even a PA or an art department person, like any of those things. And none of them had broken out. And every one of them, on every set you'll ever go to, people are like, oh, they should put this in theaters. Somebody will say that on literally every movie you work on. It does not matter what the movie is. I'm not going to impugn any movie but I will say, when I was working on these movies for David Pryor in Mobile, Alabama, Raw Justice and Mutant Species and whatnot, there was always like somebody saying like, man, this is great. This should go to theaters. Everyone says that. When we were making Blair Witch, I think our biggest hope was maybe this could get a home video release. Maybe it could play festivals. Maybe it will be watchable. We don't know. And, we're watching the footage as it comes in, like their high 8 camera, we're looking at the footage, and I saw some really compelling stuff, but there was over 30 hours of footage that Ed and Dan, whittled down to 90 minutes. And that was the good 90 minutes. That was the 90 minutes that told the story. But, think of how many, infinite possibilities there were that would have not told an interesting story. So not just coming up with an interesting idea. Had Ed and Dan not been really good editors, it wouldn't have landed. So, yeah, I mean, there was no sense of that. And honestly, I had worked on another movie about a year earlier in Mobile, Alabama for David Pryor, a different director, though, a guy named Brian Todd, called The Pack, which was another crazy low-budget movie. It was like a $65,000 monster movie, and I'd made the monster for them. And it was the most fun I'd ever had on a set. And then Blair Witch happened, and then that became the most fun I'd ever had making a movie. The Pack you've never heard of because it didn't turn out especially well, and it didn't get a great release. Blair Witch you've heard of because it struck a nerve, and it was kind of a game-changing film almost accidentally.
Well, and talk about striking that nerve. So you finish the film and you get a distribution deal and the film comes out, and that alone is, huge accomplishment. But then when the film does what it does, at what point were you seeing what was happening and saying, I can't believe this is actually happening? What was that like?
Well, before it even got released, so I moved to Los Angeles in January of 1999 with my girlfriend, Alicia, who is now my wife, and we have a kid together. And we had arrived in LA the day after the premiere at Sundance. And so we had just arrived in LA, and we were at a Carl's Jr., which is a chain restaurant, like a Burger King kind of place out here. And this has never happened to me since, but some guy walking out was like, hey, you want the paper? And I was like, sure. Wow, people are really, really friendly here in LA. And he handed me this newspaper, and I flipped over the style section, and there was a picture, and the headline said, like, artisan catches a witch at midnight or whatever it was. I don't know the exact headline. And it was a picture of the 5 principal guys from Haxon Films who had made Blair Witch. And it was like, holy crap. And we had just driven across the country, and I had been sick the whole way. And we were like, screw it. We need to go to Sundance right now. And we put all of our stuff into storage, and we got in our car, and we picked up Neil Fredericks, who was the director of photography on Blair Witch. We drove to Park City, not exactly knowing where we were going to stay, but knowing that we had a couple options and we were, going to be able to survive. But that was when I started to see that it was a big deal, because there were lines around the block for people at Sundance to see it, and it was the buzz film at Sundance. And it was like a huge amount of buzz even for Sundance. And then, went back to reality, took a job answering phones at a corporate headhunting company while I tried to get myself established in LA. The movie came out, 6-7 months later. And we went to the New Art Theater in Santa Monica to the opening of it. And again, line around the block. And I would hear people talking about it in diners. And it was like, okay, like somehow this goofy thing that I did with my college buddies is now, it's now water cooler talk. It was surreal, because it literally was a $25,000 movie, a movie that cost, what a car would cost, made by not very many people on really no budget, and suddenly it had hit a nerve. It had blown up, and that was crazy. It was exciting, but it was also just like, it's one of the things that's so weird when it happens. You don't almost even know how to react to it.
So after the Blair Witch Project, you worked on a couple projects that came your way as a result of the film. But in 2004, you formed Visible Man Productions to focus on special projects which tend to, it said, walk the line between content and advertising. Explain the focus of the company.
when Blair Witch was getting ready to come out, Artisan was going to produce a TV special for Sci-Fi Channel that was ultimately called Curse of the Blair Witch. And it was a fake documentary about sort of the backstory of Blair Witch. And they would release it like it was a real documentary and would tease that these students had gone missing. So it's like within the story world of the Blair Witch Project. And Mike Manello was sort of spearheading the producing of it in Orlando. And again, I was answering telephones at a corporate headhunting company in Sherman Oaks, California. They approached me because I think Ed and Dan and Greg were all going to Cannes, or they were going to something exciting in entertainment industry-ish, and they needed someone to write it. And so I wrote that special, and which included writing bios for all the actors, for all the characters. So they would, the characters would memorize this story, basically, not dialogue, and then they'd be interviewed as themselves with the information in that interview, and the interview would come out very authentic. If you cast it well, you can get what feels to all the world like a real interview. And so they did that. It was a huge hit for Sci-Fi Channel. And then Ed and Dan were off getting ready to make their follow-up movie, and they kind of didn't want to do anything Blair Witch related. I think they wanted to sort of define themselves separately from it. And Artisan wanted a TV special like Curse when Blair Witch premiered on Showtime, and Showtime wanted it too. So the Haxon guys sort of said, well, why don't you talk to Ben? He wrote Curse. He's a director. He can do it. And that opened a door for me to my first paid directing job for a thing called the Burkittsville 7, which was made for Showtime. And then they wanted a Curse of the Blair Witch like special for Blair Witch 2. Now getting back to your question about Visible Man. The head of marketing at Artisan when we started doing Burkittsville 7 was a guy named John Hageman. He had moved to Revolution Studios before Blair Witch 2 was even made or came out. He was already off. And in 2004, Guillermo del Toro had the original Hellboy movie coming out, and John wanted a TV special that built a conspiracy theory around the BPRD in the same way that we had done a TV special that kind of built a real folklore around Blair Witch. So he had me come in, and we met, and we pitched some ideas around, and they ultimately hired me to do it. And Matt Compton, who I did not know Matt in Orlando, but he had lived in Orlando. He was a good friend of Ed Sanchez's. But I'd met him through Blair Witch because he had worked on Blair Witch a little bit. And then when I moved out to LA, he and I got to be friends. And Matt is a producer. And I went to him and said, like, hey, would you be interested in doing this? And, it had a modest budget, but it was enough to get paid okay on. And so we did it. So we founded Visible Man to do that. And then after that, we ended up doing a lot of stuff, a great deal of it for Mike Manello, who at that point had founded Campfire in New York. So we did a series of like short action films that played as part of a really interesting ad campaign for the Audi A3 when the A3 launched. We did some stuff for the TV series The 4400 and the TV series True Blood. And there was a video game called Homefront that we did stuff for. And so we would do these campaigns where we were usually creating video content that would live online somewhere or be part of an online campaign. A lot of them were very subversive because we'd be creating like fake vlogs, or for True Blood, we created like home video of a vampire attacking a car. So we had to kind of say, it was sort of like a mini found footage movie. Like, what would you see? You had to plan where the camera would pan so you could, for all the special effects and stuff that we had to do, we had to kind of plan it out like a regular shoot. But now we're not making stuff like Blair Witch. We're making stuff like a normal shoot. Like, okay, well, we're doing this shot at this time and this shot at that time. A lot of them were like that. Honestly, my favorite of the bunch was the Audi, The Art of the Heist short films, because they were, it was like making little mini movies. We made 8 little mini movies for them, and it's a blast.
And then in 2008, you directed Alien Raiders for Warner Brothers, which was a critically acclaimed sci-fi horror movie. Talk about that film.
Yeah, well, that was actually through Dan Myrick from Blair Witch. So I guess,
okay.
This is all 6 degrees of Blair Witch. But Dan had founded a company out here called Raw Feed. He co-founded it with a guy named John Scheiben and a guy named Tony Krantz. Tony Krantz is kind of a big deal producer, and John Scheiben was I think he was one of the showrunners on Breaking Bad, or one of the producers on Breaking Bad, and he's done a lot of TV stuff. So it was them and Dan, and they had done 3 movies, I want to say in 2005 or 2006, and they'd done well. So they were greenlit for 3 more, and the budgets went slightly up. But Dan was working on a film at the time called The Objective, and he wasn't able to focus on doing the feature. And so he kind of reached out to me, and we talked about it. And it was, it was a tight experience because I was hired in like September, and the shoot was in December of 2007. And during that period of time, there was a Writers Guild strike. So the script had to be finished, like completely finished before the strike started. But because of the strike, we got access to certain actors who were out of work because TV was basically shut down at that time. But yeah, that was a very exciting, crazy whirlwind. And, got to make a feature, got to work with an amazing cast, an amazing crew. The cinematographer, who I believe actually is from, I want to say New Smyrna Beach or Daytona Beach originally, was a guy named Walt Lloyd, who Walt shot, shortcuts for Robert Altman and sex lies and videotapes for Steven Soderbergh. Like he's, a legend. Got to work with just, some amazing people. Our editor was a guy named Augie Hess, who'd worked for William Friedkin a bunch. And, I was really lucky that I got to work with just some amazing people. Features can take 2 years to make, but we had like, I want to say 6 months from the moment I was hired till it was turned in. It was a pretty fast turnaround.
And then fast forward a couple more years to 2015 and 16, and you directed and edited Future Boyfriend, a sci-fi romantic comedy that made its way to the Tribeca Film Festival. Talk about that film and going to Tribeca.
I always return to theater, and I do a lot of behind the scenes stuff in theater. And one of the things I do that kind of combines my love of film and my love of theater at the same time is projection design for theater. So that's like interactive video. And there was a science fiction one-act play festival that ran for about 3 years out here, and they hired me to do projection design. And Future Boyfriend was one of the plays that was on in there. So I'd done some projection design. I mean, I did projection design for literally every play that went through there, and it was dozens of shows. When the festival was over, it was probably 2014-ish, the 2 actors who were the leads loved the material and wanted to turn it into a film, but the woman who had directed the play was not a film director and wasn't interested in trying to pursue that. So they asked some of the other actors who were part of Sci-Fest, and one of them was a friend of mine named Bruno Oliver, and he recommended that they meet with me. And I met with them, and I pitched them a bunch of ideas about how I would kind of turn it into a movie, because it's a scene. It's a one-act play, and it's just 2 people at a table in a restaurant, which is visually not the most exciting thing to shoot and could get really boring. And so I pitched them some ideas, and, several of them made it into it, and we worked with the writer. And I was at a point in my career, because like a romantic comedy is not really my forte, but I was at a place where I was like, whatever the next thing is that someone offers me, I'm just going to say yes to it. And they were going to do a Kickstarter campaign to raise some money, and I was like, if you can raise that money, I'll do it. And then they raised like a fourth of the money they were looking for the first day, and I'm like, well, I guess I'm doing this. And it was a lot of fun. From theater, I actually know French Stewart, and I asked him if he could play. There's like a Siri-like AI character that is a hologram. That's like a futuristic thing. I asked French if he would do that, and he agreed to come on board and do it. The restaurant part of the shoot was a long day. It was like a 16-hour shoot, but it was a lot of fun, funny stuff. The 2 leads are amazing. I got to work with a DP who I've been working with a lot, named George Foyt. He shoots 20 Seconds to Live, and he shoots a lot of other stuff that I do. He does amazing work and really just kind of raises the production value of everything. I was, edited it. I mean, I've been doing a lot of editing, probably going back to actually in Florida. I did a short film before I moved to LA called The Meeting, like right before I moved to LA. And on that, I learned how to edit on a nonlinear system, the very same system Blair Witch was edited on, a Media 100 at the Haxon office. And I've been editing ever since, in Final Cut Pro, this or that, moved to Premiere in 2011. So, a lot of times when you hire me to direct something, you're kind of getting a bonus in that I know how to edit as well. And so I say hire in air quotes on a short film, because there's not like real money involved or changing hands there. But, like that's part of the fun for me is I get to edit it. And yeah, I was very pleasantly shocked and surprised that we got into Tribeca, because again, like romantic comedy is just not a thing I do. Or I guess it wasn't then, and now it kind of is. But I approached the material like I would approach anything else, and it was a blast to shoot. And then playing Tribeca, obviously dream come true. But I've like submitted every film project I've made to all the big festivals since I was at UCF, and I was kind of blown away and shocked that the first thing that got in was Future Boyfriend, not because I'm not proud of it, but because it's like so far away from the stuff I normally do. Tribeca, is among the top 3 best festivals in the country, or biggest festivals in the country to go to.
And you mentioned Bob DeRosa earlier, and I mentioned he's an interview in a previous episode of the Film Florida podcast. Talk about how you know Bob and the project you're currently working with him on.
I know Bob from the Enzian Theater in Maitland, Florida. We have disputed the year, whether it was like 1992 or 1993 or 1994, which films we were there with. But they do a yearly local film festival with only local filmmakers called the Brouhaha. And
yes,
my recollection of it is I had a short that I'd made called Vaporman, and he had a short he'd made called Hardwired. And we met in the parking lot, and he was getting ready to make a thing called God Laughed. And I was getting ready to make a thing, my senior thesis film in college, called Meeting Mr. Subian. But the Enzian, I almost feel like the Enzian, almost no part of my filmmaking life doesn't somehow tack back to the Enzian. I took my first date ever there. I met my wife there. My first film I ever made played there. Blair. I was working there when I went to work on Blair Witch. I was a manager in the projections there. So, the Brouhaha is an important thing for me. My first film ever played at the Brouhaha. So Bob and I met, we hit it off, and I moved to LA maybe a year or 2 before he moved to LA. We've always stayed in touch, and probably starting in like 2002, 2003, he and I started, there's a theater company we're both involved with called the Sacred Fools Theater Company in Hollywood. And they do a late night show. They've always done a late night show. The show itself has changed. So at that time it was called Crime Scene. Now they do one called Serial Killers. And it's like a late night goofy comedy, gross out, whatever you want to do kind of show. You just kind of, each piece is like 10 minutes long. And we started doing stuff for Crime Scene in like 2002, 2003-ish. And we just kept working together on stuff like that. And we had kicked around doing features. We developed a couple feature scripts together over the years that we'd hoped to get made and didn't get enough traction out of, or for whatever reason, were talked out of pursuing them. But we kept doing the theater stuff, and we worked on a lot of theater stuff together. And I had said to him several times, like, hey, man, like, what if we made like a web series instead of doing these late night theater things? Like, that way we could share whatever it is we do with a bigger audience. And we developed a thing called 20 Seconds to Live. And we just last month finished releasing season 2 of 20 Seconds to Live. There's about 13 episodes of it now, but they're all like 2.5 minutes long. And it's very much like when I work without Bob, I have a certain sensibility. When he works without me, he has a certain sensibility. This is like the melding of our sensibility as we've seen it happen over theater, kind of dark, kind of funny. Where we take the risks, the creative risks is, hopefully a little unexpected, but there's like a certain chemistry that we have when we work on a thing together. So that's been, kind of like our personal passion project. And then about 1.5 years ago, we were hired, again, through Mike Manello from Blair Witch, to Mike and a guy he works with named Nick Bracchia had pitched and sold an idea to Shudder, which is a horror streaming service like Netflix, but all horror and thriller and sci-fi. It's called Video Palace, and they weren't going to be able to write it or produce it. And so he reached out to me, and Mike and I had been talking about, doing our own narrative podcast project for years anyway. So it was something that kind of fit right into an ongoing conversation Mike and I had. They gave us sort of the pitch document that they had, and I brought Bob on. That was my first big sale. Was Bob, who has experience in episodic television as a writer and a producer. I was like, I need somebody who gets how to do episodes better than I do. And also Bob and I work really well together. And so together we kind of broke the whole thing. We wrote the whole thing. We wrote it fast. It was about 9 weeks to write a 183-page script. There's 10 episodes.
Wow.
And then we recorded it all, because it's audio only. We were able to record it all in about 5 days. And then we had, I think, like a month and a half to do all the post, which, is its own epic tale of an amazing company out here called Diablo Sound, and a sound designer named Jeremy Lee, who blew us away and we're able to finish, what we had begun. But yeah, and Bob and I think I'm allowed to say this. I've never signed an NDA about this, but based on that, we have a project we're developing for Audible. So we'll see if it gets made. Who knows?
Nice. Ben, I've talked to a number of people that are writers, directors, or producers, or maybe a little bit of all of them, but your credits are even more diverse than that. You talked about editing and some makeup stuff and electrical department, cinematographer. It seems like you have purposely not specialized in just one or two things, or is that purely by accident?
Well, I think these days it helps to be a generalist. I mean, like the company electric stuff, that all would have been when I was in college. Those would be like, projects I worked on at the Valencia Film Program. The majority of my credits are directing, and then after that, probably makeup. And sometimes I don't really consider myself a cinematographer, but I've shot some stuff for some friends. I know how to get an exposure and all that. Editing is something that I learned. I think that I learned every skill that I learned out of necessity, because I didn't have like giant budgets being offered up to me. And working with another editor, with several exceptions, including Augie Hess, who edited Alien Raiders, most of the time when I'm working with another editor, I'm just kind of trying to get them to do the thing I would do as an editor. Luckily, I can skip the middleman on that one and just edit. Like learning how to edit is like learning any other craft. Like it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of work. You have to learn how to use the software, and you also have to learn the aesthetics of editing, and those are different skills. But
Right.
I've been doing it since college. I've been doing it for over 20 years now, and it's something I really enjoy editing, because it's like kind of putting together the puzzle, and it's a little bit like writing. But I do think that what you find in the industry these days are a lot of generalists. Like I do a lot of freelance work for this division at Disney, and everybody who works there has basically the same skill set that I have, some way better than me. But it's like everybody in that group, they can conduct an interview, they can shoot an interview, they can light, they can run sound, they can edit, color correct, mix audio, add music, they can do all that stuff. And I think that the current suite of digital tools that are just literally everywhere in the world, wherever you look now, when I was in film school, having access to a good camera, having access to editing was part of the reason you would even go to film school in the first place, because you would have no access to those things anywhere else. But today, your telephone might shoot 4K video. You can get an editing software for free called DaVinci Resolve that is as professional as anything else you're going to get. And it's a slightly dumbed down version of it. The full version is $300, so anyone has the opportunity to learn how to do this stuff now. I've grown into an industry that was doing that while I was working in it. When I get off the phone with you today, I'm going to be editing a project for another client all day long. Knowing how to edit is a good way to make some money between my own personal projects, and it's something that I like doing. You almost wonder now what the argument is for film school. And I think I told you, I do a cinematography podcast where I interview a lot of pretty big cinematographers. And I'll ask a lot of them if they came through a film school track, like, what's the advantage of film school? And everyone basically has the same answer that I would give. It's less about learning how to use the equipment, which you can do nowadays. You can go on YouTube and learn how to use anything. But it's to meet people who are coming up at the same time as you, and to kind of have the dedicated studio time to go make your own stuff. And to me, that's the real reason to go to film school. I know you didn't ask, but myself being kind of a perfectly average example of that, like going to film school is how I met Greg Hale, and knowing Greg Hale is how I ended up working on the Blair Witch Project. And honestly, I went to UCF where all those other guys went. They were just 2 years ahead of me, so I didn't know them as well as I knew Greg. And there are plenty of there's endless examples of people who've met people they ended up working for or hiring or whatever by going to film school. UCF and Valencia are both very different now than when I was there. But, I really look back very positively on my time at both of those programs, and, the lessons that I learned and how they've affected my life.
Well, yeah, it's a great point. Anybody can, grab a camera or get on YouTube and learn all these things, but it's a completely different story to meet the people that are eventually, as we've talked about so many times through this interview, these people that have stayed threads within your life and your career. You don't get that on YouTube. And so I think you're exactly correct that the experience of film school is probably more important than the skills you actually learn while you're there.
Yeah, I do think that like being in a place where you can fail safely is a big deal. And, if you don't have a skill or you don't know how to do something, you're going to fall on your face a lot. I sometimes speak at film schools nowadays. I actually spoke at Cal State Northridge a couple weeks ago. And, I feel like somebody going into film school today would have probably pretty good experience with shooting and editing, and probably would have more hours of having done those things than I did 5-6 years after I got out of college. Like, they know how to frame a shot, they know how to expose a shot, they know how to edit, they might know how to color correct, they might know how to add music, or they might compose their own music. And I feel like, so what that probably means is it's probably more competitive to get into a film school nowadays. And also, when you get there, there's probably less groundwork to cover in terms of like, here's how you edit. But the aesthetics of editing are a different thing to learn entirely. And at Valencia, there was an editing teacher named Gary Blair, who I'm unfortunately not in touch with, but I thought I learned a lot from him. And he'd edited a lot of television, and he kind of gave us his basic principles of editing, and I think about them when I edit all the time. That's what the professors can offer you. And then also, offering you just like time, like say like, okay, I'm cutting out this period of my life to go make a short film, which the older you get, you have a mortgage, or you have kids, or you have other commitments, or a full-time job. It's very, very hard to cut out the time and say, okay, this weekend I'm going to go make a short film, when really every cell of your body just wants to lay on the couch. But when you're in film school, your job is to go do that. And so it kind of forces you to think like that when it's hard to do. It's not even like if you were in art school and you had to go paint a painting. That's something you can literally do by yourself. But film requires some number of people, some pre-planning. Getting in that habit, getting that kind of in your bones is important, and it's hard to do. It's hard to do without school. Obviously, there are people who do it. I'm not saying that you're not a good filmmaker if you don't go to film school, but I saw and see a lot of value in film school.
Besides the film school angle, what advice do you give people that want to get in the industry? How do they follow in your footsteps?
Well, I mean, the thing about following in anyone's footsteps is you can't. What I've learned about this business is like there isn't like a set of instructions I can give you that will land you in especially if you're looking to be a director or a writer or a cinematographer. There's not really like go to this hollow log in the woods and you knock 3 times and solve the gremlin's riddle and you'll get in. Everyone has to kind of make their own way. I think that like if you're just looking to work, like if you're like, I want to be in the camera department, then there are very specific ways to go about doing that. But if your goal is, I want to be a cinematographer, a different road. And I believe, and this is just me, that like you don't get to be a director by doing anything except directing. So, which isn't to say don't have other skills or don't not direct. Like, to this day, I'll still work in other capacities on people's stuff. I'll edit stuff. I'll do a lot of different things on various projects. But it's like, return to directing as often as possible. Go work on other projects and watch that director work. Ask that director lots of questions. When I was still in Orlando, actually one of the only real art department jobs I had was on a film called All Shook Up. And the director on that was a guy named Henry Left. And I asked him a lot of questions and I showed him my reel and I got some real good feedback. And most people, especially nowadays too, where you could just email someone a Vimeo link. Like back then I had to like hand someone a VHS tape. But now it can be like, here's a Vimeo link. Could you watch it and give me your honest feedback? You're not going to get honest feedback from a lot of people, but some people will give you honest feedback or kind of tell you like, well, here's what you can do with this. And I think it's just a process of like, keep doing it, do it as often as you can. It's a discouraging business. The discouragement doesn't come in the form of bad feedback. It comes in the form of no feedback. Like you put something out in the world and hear nothing. That can be very, very frustrating. I'd rather hear someone say, Ben made the worst thing I've ever seen than I put a thing out that I've slaved and sweated blood over just to hear crickets, which is what you hear a lot of times and you just kind of get used to that. But if you want to direct, start directing. Direct whatever you can. Direct, make some films on your phone and cut them together and start learning the skills. Because before you get to the fun, creative stuff, there are barriers of just understanding the language of how it all fits together and how you're going to use it differently than somebody else. So to me, that's probably the number one thing. If you want to write. If you want to direct. If you want to DP, go to a film school and put your name on a bulletin board and tell people that you're a DP and have some kind of reel to show that you can do it. And if you don't have a reel, then you're going to have to go out and shoot some stuff. Even if you had to rent all the gear to do it, renting a really high-end camera today would cost less than shooting 10 minutes of 16 millimeter film, processing it and transferring it to video. When I was at UCF, that's what we had to do. We had to shoot everything on film, and we had to pay for our own film. And every student loan I took out was only to pay for film stock, processing, and transfer, really. Nowadays, those are not the barriers. And, you can look to movies like Tangerine or what was that? Steven Soderbergh made a film called Unsane that were both literally shot on iPhones and played in movie theaters. And, in the case of Tangerine, it won Sundance. So there's kind of no excuse to not be experimenting and doing it. There's a lot of information out there, podcasts and blogs and stuff about how to get the looks and stuff that you want to get across. But to me, it's all about finding the stories that inspire and excite you and throwing yourself into those. You're going to get people's attention, in my opinion, when you do something that you've really invested your heart and soul into, more than trying to give the market what you think they want. Like, don't second guess stuff. Make stuff you care about. I mean, if you're hired to make something that the market wants, then great. But early on, make lots of friends, work on other people's stuff, help other people get what they want. And when you have the capital, make your own stuff, whatever it is that your craft is.
What's next for you, Ben? Where can people see your name in the credits?
Well, right now I'm working on development on a project with Wayne Brady, also someone I knew from Orlando, and Jonathan Mangum, who I know since I was at UCF. And we're developing the project, but it hasn't been greenlit. And then, like I told you, Bob DeRosa and I have a development deal with Audible. So we may be doing a horror audio fiction for Audible, an original piece. That right now we're just kind of waiting for all the contract stuff to get sorted out. And where else? I don't know. I mean, we just released 20 Seconds to Live. So if you have a minute, go to 20stl.com and check out some of our gross out comedic anthology shorts. It was a fun project to work on, and we hope to do more. But I had a son in the middle of doing season 2, so it took a long time to get season 2 finished. And that's about it for me at the moment.
Is there anywhere people can go to learn more about you, website, social media, anything else you want to plug?
You can find the links to all my social media on my website, which is benrockonline.com. So if you just go to benrock online, if you go to Twitter, I'm at Neptune Salad. If you have a question, ask me. I'll probably answer. Unless the question is hire me for a job, I'll probably answer your question, Blair Witch or otherwise. And Facebook, LinkedIn, all the usual suspects.
Well, Ben, I really appreciate you being on the podcast today. Thanks so much for sharing your stories and the insight, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me. I really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Film Florida podcast. We're going to take a few weeks off for the holidays, so check back in early January for new episodes. If you're not already a member, please consider joining Film Florida at filmflorida.org and visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at teespring.com/stores/Film Florida, and please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.